Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon or good evening. Welcome to this second day of our Immigration and Nationality Law Commission mid-year meeting. We had a very interesting discussion yesterday on emergency and short-term erosions of immigration rights. Today, our topic is the emergence from the pandemic, a reinvented framework for global immigration. And as the world recovers from the pandemic, global immigration is at a crossroads. Will any of the short-term restrictive measures on migration prescribed by governments become long-term barriers to entry? Is global immigration on a permanent downward trajectory due to the rise of remote work? Or will the rise of remote work create a boom in the market for global services that would also stimulate the demand for global immigration? This session shall examine these questions as it prognosticates a post-pandemic path for the global immigration in the 2020s. So today we have 5 wonderful speakers which will discuss this topic. We have Patricia Pinto from Switzerland. We have Andreea HAULBERT from France. We have Jacqueline Bart from Canada. And then we have Ben Sheldrick from the UK. And to conclude, we have Dirk Nuyts, who will wrap up the whole session with a global view. Thank you so much to all of you for participating yesterday and today, and we look forward to a very fruitful discussion. And I will now give the floor to Patricia. Patricia, whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you, Hervé. So I will address the first question. Will any of the short-term restrictive measures on migration prescribed by governments become long-term barriers to entry? So in Switzerland, as of March 2020, the Swiss Federal Council has taken measures to combat the spread of COVID-19. And these measures concern in particular a strong limitation of migration to Switzerland. So these measures were based on the Swiss constitutions, which grants certain rights to the government in case of necessity. In the course of 2020 and 2021, the Swiss government drew up the so-called COVID Act, accepted by the people on last June 13, and this law gives the government certain temporary prerogatives in migration matters and other matters. According to this law, the Swiss government may in particular introduce restrictions on the entry of foreign nationals and their admissions in Switzerland, with the exception of family reunification, that it's the and also unmarried partners and their children. It cannot be limited, but the others can. Currently, Switzerland has 2 regimes restricting entry into the country. On the one hand, there is a list established by the State Secretariat for Migration regarding the migration aspects. And on the other hand, there is a list established by the Federal Office of Public Health regarding the public health aspects. Both lists have an impact on migration. I will explain these 2 lists a bit more. And these two lists are valid until today, 11:59 p.m. So the State Secretariat for Migration's list contains countries for which there are no entry restrictions in Switzerland. These are the EU EFTA countries, as well as certain third countries, such as South Korea and New Zealand, for example. It is important to keep in mind that the entry ban do not concern workers or residents in Switzerland who have a valid work and residence permit, or who have obtained a visa in order to enter Switzerland to obtain such permit. These restrictions, this entry ban is aimed at tourists for stays up to 90 days. Then you have the list from the Federal Office of Public Health. This list contains a list of countries a list of countries, and people traveling from these countries are subject to mandatory quarantine if they have stayed in one of these countries in the last 10 days before their arrival in Switzerland. According to this list, some people may be exempted from quarantine if they are vaccinated or have recently contracted COVID-19 less than 6 months ago. There are also exemptions, quarantine exemptions possible for professional reasons, but in order to obtain such exemption, the person has to request it before traveling. So it takes, let's say that there were less professional travels during this, the last year. However, if a person is coming from a country with a worrying variant, such as Brazil, India, or the UK, the exceptions that I've just mentioned do not apply. Then, since the Swiss Federal Council press conference of last Wednesday, starting tomorrow, from an immigration point of view, the entry ban will not apply anymore to persons who have been vaccinated in the last year, in the last 12 months, regardless of the country they are coming from. The Swiss Federal Council also added, and the State Secretary for Migration added, have extended the list of certain countries not submitted to entry ban. Therefore, if people entering from the countries not submitted to entry ban can freely enter Switzerland, and if the countries are not in this list, people can enter Switzerland if they were vaccinated. They have been vaccinated in the last 12 months, or if they have, for example, a professional reason, but also it's the same, they have to request it before traveling. Then regarding the Federal Office of Public Health, the new list, valid starting tomorrow, only people coming from a country with a worrying variant will be submitted to mandatory testing and quarantine, except if they prove that they have been vaccinated or have contracted and recovered from COVID-19 during the last 12 months. Currently, there are only three countries in this list: the UK, India, and Nepal, and it is not sure yet if the authorities will add Brazil to this list. In view of the improvement of the health situation in Switzerland, and in particular thanks to the vaccination campaigns, Switzerland is gradually opening its borders again. This new decision from last Wednesday is a big step. And we can also see a recovery in the flow of migration. According to the State Secretariat for Migration, the arrivals among non-permanent residents in the foreign population increased by 34.1% compared to the same period in 2020. And given the recent developments regarding the approach of Switzerland in order to fight COVID-19 and its wish to reopen the borders, it seems difficult that the restrictions will be extended in the long term. And also persons from certain countries wishing to work in Switzerland who have obtained a valid work permit are not concerned by the current COVID-19 restrictions that are valid until today. So it will not slow down immigration. Then the second question. Is global migration on a permanent downward trajectory due to the rise of remote work, or will the rise of remote work create a boom in the market for global services that also will stimulate the demand for global immigration? So it is clear that remote work has changed the way of work for millions of employees since the beginning of the pandemic. According to the Swiss Federal Statistics Office, the year 2020, during the year 2020, and in the context of the fight against the pandemic, the proportion of employed people working remotely has increased. It went from 24.6% in 2019 to 34.1% in 2020. And it represented an increase of 1.5 million people in Switzerland. It seems also clear that the pandemic will influence the way we work in the future. Nevertheless, there are several agreements that tend to show that remote work will not have a major impact on immigration, at least in Switzerland. First of all, from a migration point of view, in order to spend more than 3 months in Switzerland, a valid permit is requested. A valid work and residence permit is requested. In this context, third country citizens are submitted to the usual restrictive conditions to obtain a valid permit, and they do not have a right to obtain such permit. Therefore, it will be difficult for them to come to Switzerland to work remotely for an employer outside of the country and obtain a permit. For EU EFTA citizens, it will be easier as they have a right to come to Switzerland. But as the usual conditions do not change, it is very unlikely that that new people working remotely will apply for permits. From a social security point of view, also, social security contributions in principle must be paid in the country of residence if the employee works more than 25% at home. Currently, and because of the pandemic, this rule does not apply until 31st December between Switzerland and Germany, Italy, Austria, and Liechtenstein, and until 30 September 2021 with France. For the other countries, this rule does not apply until June 30, but discussions are planned to extend the status quo. However, it is likely that this rule will be applicable again in the future. Thus, there is a reason to believe that remote work will not be generalized and will not slow down migration. Also, there are, at least in Switzerland, certain fields for which remote work is not possible. For example, the banks, for reasons of the confidentiality, some banks have forbidden remote work during lockdown, and some banks and some law firms have forbidden remote work in a foreign country during the pandemic. So from a social point of view, it is likely that the employees it is unlikely, that employees will exclusively work from home, regardless of the location, as remote work has a strong impact on the social relationships of the employees. And there is a strong, at least in Switzerland, there is a strong tendency to return to the company, to the office, and not and stop working from home. Thus, the common workplace will not disappear, and the migration flow of employees is not on a downward trajectory. Also, according to the State Secretariat for Migration, the permit applications have not slowed down lately. So we really do not see that migration is in a downward trajectory. So in conclusion, we do not see that immigration will decrease in Switzerland, given the fact that the borders are reopening. So it will also increase professional travels, business travels, for example, and it will change the way of work, as the companies are moving towards a mixed system with the possibility to work a few days from home and the rest of the time on the company's premises. It will give to the employees more freedom to organize their working weeks and have a better work-life balance. That's it for Switzerland.
Thank you, Patricia, here. So just a quick comment question here. It's interesting that you brought up the issue of Social Security contributions, because I think one of the big things that we hear about digital nomad visas, the ability for people to travel and gain entry into other countries in order to work. But I think what's sort of an issue that's coming, but it's sort of been in the background, has been transactional costs. You know, the compliance costs of having, remote work for an employee in country A for a company that's based, say, in Switzerland. And so I think that's sort of an important point that you brought into play, that perhaps, governments will start to move and recognize at least the relationship, or that remote work, even if it's not going to dominate, will still be a material part of the work landscape here, and making adjustments for that, because I think we're going to start to see more and more of that. So I think that's a really good, important point. Thank you for raising what's going on in the EU, or going on in Switzerland via the EU. Thank you.
Yes, thank you indeed. We may have the time for one more question, because we have to move to the next presentation. Okay, so now we will move to Andreea HAULBERT from Paris, who will discuss the French perspective. Andreea, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hervé. Yes, I will start this presentation with some statistic, just in order to say that obviously, like everywhere in the world, in France also, the immigration was divided by half in last year, in 2020. So OECD was made a statistic, and they indeed mentioned a historic shock with significant variation depending on the country. For the French immigration, the information was indeed confirmed, because the number of asylum application in 2020 was 41% less than in 2019. So eviction also was less, due, of course, to the greater difficulties in organizing travels with the closure of the border and the closure of many consulates and the collapse of the air traffic, etc. This health crisis will also have brought some sudden drop of the number of the visa issued. So we had in France near to less of 80% of the number of the visa delivered in 2020. We had near 700,000 documents against 3.5 million in 2019. So the professional immigration was particularly concerned, with a drop of over 30%. We had one of the most challenging type of immigration for professional immigration. It's talent passport, and we had a decrease of 25% for the immigration, for the professional immigration. Finally, the only branch of the immigration who has, which is the largest part of the immigration flow, it is the family immigration, was impacted less than the immigration, the professional one, and asylum was impacted like 17% less. Indeed, this I say this statistic in order to arrive to the conclusion that global immigration will never be the same. Actually, after this strange particular 20 years. So under the effect of the pandemic, immigration statistics were indeed reduced, like we never we never had such a statistic of the French immigration. So what are the observations we can make for the next year, for this year 2021 and the next year, and what are the prognostics for the post-pandemic, which I hope we are in this situation post-pandemic. I hope we will not have another episode of COVID. So the first observation I will make for this point, the pandemic has made obvious that in rich countries like France, entire sectors cannot function without immigration labor. So we, as a general rule, a French job market in France, a French job market test is applicable for a work permit application for a foreign national. When processing the application, the authorities will take into account the unemployment statistic for the position offered to the applicant, and we verify that the efforts made by the company to hire applicants already authorized to work in France. So the employment situation, which is called also job market test, it's not opposable to an application for a work permit presented for a foreigner wishing to exercise an activity in a profession of one of the professional families for which France has a difficulty of recruitment. Okay, so approve. I say this just as a general rule to show that approve that the French government understood this first observation that immigration cannot, entire sectors in France cannot function without immigration. Approve is that on April 1st, 2021, 13 years after the first appearance, the list of the job considered to not have enough available candidates on the French market has been updated. Actually, the first list was dated in 2008, and we are waiting we are waiting for the new list since years, because actually the list made in 2018 was obsolete, obviously, and we actually told to the ministry, you will need to change it, but they will never did. Actually, this pandemic helped the French government to make a step and to update this list. So this list is established now by region, and new occupation in construction, steel and metallurgy fields have been added, along with, of course, certain health and agriculture professions. So this shows that my first observation, it's true. Actually, we cannot function without immigration. A second observation that I can make is the fact that the high-level executive changed the way to work, and remote work done during the pandemic, it's about to be extended beyond the end of the sanitary crisis. Indeed, the demand for this category of immigrants was very high before the COVID-19, and the level of education of migrants, it's improving. However, this intellectual world, which do not need to touch the materials, can work remotely. So we knew this, but the pandemic has shown that at what scale this system can be extended and generalized. This development will change, we have consequences for the mobility for this highly qualified population. Students, engineers, researchers, high-level health professionals, rich countries are in competition for these brains. And the impact of the pandemic on mobility with remote work can profoundly change the condition of recruitment, as well as the physical organization and higher education. We can already think about all the questions that this perspective opens. Do you need a residency permit for working remotely? What will be the tax status, Clayton, of highly qualified immigration but at distance? What will be how can we actually I had a file this week. I have this French company wanting to hire a British national, but the British national wants to work remotely from London. The French company has not an affiliate in London. So what will be the contract? It will be a French contract, an UK, a British contract? We do not know. But if the contract is British, what will be the social security? What will be the taxes? And this person needs to be 1 week per month in France. What will be the work permit applicable to this person? We do not have actually in the French, the current French immigration processes, we do not have a work permit applicable to this situation. We do not have a work permit only for 1 week per month. We do not have a residency permit for a person which is actually not a tax resident, but it can be a tax resident because his salary it's earned in France. So we have so many questions linked to this international remote work that we will need to handle. So another point which is very problematic in France now, it's the vaccination company. Why? Because actually in France, opening actually issued on June 9, 2021, strategy of reopening of borders. Actually, all my clients waited for this 9 June 2021, like, you know, the day when the human will go on the moon for the next second time. But it was not very actually they thought that everything will be open and France will open the borders. But what this strategy decided that a classification of countries has been done on the basis of the health indicators. So we have now green countries, orange countries, and red countries. Actually, the orange country are also, I don't know why, called amber. Actually, amber is the new orange. I like to say this because I do not understand this amber color. Okay, so we have green, amber, and red countries, and actually workers and immigrants from those countries can enter France with some condition. And one of the conditions is the vaccination. So indeed, from June 9, 2021, only some vaccines authorized by the European Union will be accepted by France, which are Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and Johnson & Johnson. So the proof we have, this is the first problem. Why? Because what about countries like Russia, where they only have Sputnik vaccines, and which is mandatory? So for this time, France cannot receive any Russian national in France because they have only Sputnik vaccine, which is not recognized in Europe. Okay, this is okay. This is a political decision. But what about North African countries like Algeria, Tunisia, like even Brazil, which are given two types of vaccine? Actually, they have a half of vaccine of AstraZeneca and another half of Chinese vaccine. So it is like a lottery, you know. actually, if you are vaccinated with the Chinese one, you cannot work in France. But if you have the AstraZeneca, and I don't know how we can choose, you can work in France. So I spoke with an HR manager this week, and I think it is sad, because he told me, I don't know if I can hire this person because he is not already vaccinated, and when he will have the Chinese one. I mean, this is not a reason to hire or not hire a foreign national. So it becomes one. So for us, this is a real problem. So we arrive at the another issue. It is the proof of vaccination. For this time, we are waiting for a decree which say what proof of vaccination is accepted in France, because in France we have a code, a security code, and they can scan it on the border. But you guys in the United States and Canada, I saw you have some vaccination, but handwritten, so which cannot be scanned by the border. So we don't know if it will be accepted or not at this stage. So we have a lot of question, and a lot of from the companies, and a lot of question to which we do not have answer, actually. So as a conclusion, I will say that it is clear that the French companies, we need to handle this change made by necessity, as working remotely was a necessity last year, and which seems to be adopted by the employees like as permanent, as comfort of life, because this can be even an element of negotiation of the contract, saying, okay, I want to work in France, but I want to stay a lot of half of time in my country, so with my friends, my family, etc. So working remotely from another country, what from as far as I see with my clients, can occur several issues for which the French companies are not already prepared, and even the French legislation is not already prepared, as tax matters linked to this international work from abroad, the social security coverage during the work abroad. For example, what is the case of the work accident from working internationally remotely? I mean, which social security will cover. So the legislation will need to change. But at this stage, a lot of my clients, international companies, indicated that they refuse the working remotely from abroad, but they are working to adapt the international mobility policies to this new current. But for this moment, there is not a lot of impact on the global mobility. So now, because the borders are open with some rules, of course, in France, we have a lot of files and a lot of demand for France. So this is for France. If you have any question, I will be happy to reply.
Thank you so much, Andreea. Very interesting.
Thank you, Andreea.
Are there any questions?
I have a first question to Andreea. So it was in fact part of my part in the end, but now I can deduct 1 minute. So one of the aspects that we have seen throughout Europe, especially, is that governments during the pandemic invested quicker in online applications, because a lot of governments were still very traditional. Everything needed to go by paper, registered mail, etc. So for instance, in Switzerland, we have seen some cantons now allow online applications, others don't. Belgium, since the 1st of May, also has online applications for some permits, like the single permit, the blue cards, and the ICT. But I saw in France, Andreea, I think it was end of March that there was like a press release or something from Gérald Darmanin, the Minister of Interior, who end of March said by 6th of April, France will introduce online services for work authorizations. Has that been successful? Because I thought next week already when he announced it. So I thought I never knew that French were so quick in implementing.
Yeah, actually it is effective because starting of the pandemic, with the pandemic, the pandemic accelerated all this online process. So it was decided in 2019, but the pandemic accelerated the thing. So they started with the residency permit application online, which is not a big success because actually each prefecture in France decided to develop this and to apply this online situation like they can. I mean, in Paris, all good online website, but in Dijon, for example, the online application is a mailbox just in front of the gate of the prefecture. So it depends on the prefecture, you know. So, but for the work authorization, indeed, starting from April 6th, it is online. The only problem is they are faster. They are faster because before was 2 months of application process, but now it is faster. I mean, you have a replay in like 1 week, but the problem now is that you have in front of you only a machine, you know, a platform, and you have no people to speak. So the problem is that not all the application, all the work application are the same, you know, they are not the same type. If you have an application which is a little different, you know, like mine, this worker who will need to work in France only 1 week per month, we do not know how to apply. I have nobody in front of me to speak, so I am obliged to write to the ministry and ask for help. So they have the limit. You cannot speak, and you can have refusal because the computer did not understand your request, and you will need to apply again. So it starts, but we have some difficulty.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to have a quick comment because Andrea, you mentioned me, and I'll just make one comment here generally that governmental systems need to catch up to reality. And so I often say that technology is racing towards the 22nd century. We're in the 21st century, but we have legal compliance systems and that have been drafted and being used that are from the 20th century. And so, I mean, I think at some point those 20th century compliance systems are going to hit a breaking point here, and I think we're seeing that now, where there's a need for revisions. And necessity is the mother of invention, as they say. And so, and perhaps a silver lining from the pandemic is that, the push towards online processing, perhaps a push as well toward a refiguring or reconfiguration of how we look at compliance systems in conjunction with remote work, such as Social Security, tax, as well as work permits. So thank you. Hervé.
Yes, thank you so much. If there are no more questions, I think we should move to our third speaker, Jacqueline from Canada. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. So today I'm going to be talking about all the issues that were raised in the topic. So basically, we've got two systems that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about quarantine legislation and immigration processing. And I'm going to be talking about both of those in the context of, number one, changes that will be reversed. So changes that have happened during COVID, during the pandemic, that will be reversed. Number two, the bad and the ugly of the law that won't change in Canada. Number three, good policies that were wrought on by the pandemic that won't change, that will stay. And the fourth point that I'm going to talk about is remote work and whether it's going to reduce immigration volumes and basically reduce the amount of movement and permanent migration. So I'm going to start with changes that were brought on by the pandemic that will be reversed. And so the biggest change, and we're starting to see it in Canada, and it was touched on by Patricia and Andrea, are that quarantine rules will have started to be reversed for people who are either fully vaccinated or who are not vaccinated, but are required in Canada urgently and cannot quarantine because they're dealing with, say, a piece of machinery that's broken down, and it would mean the layoff of approximately 200 or 300 people in Canada. So those folks can come into Canada. So there's no requirement to quarantine if you're vaccinated, and there's no requirement to quarantine if, for example, you have to come in for the death of a parent, and or they're on their deathbed in palliative care, and you want to visit them as a very close member of the family, or you're coming in, like I said earlier, to fix a piece of machinery. But obviously, in the last month, we've had a huge, important change in Canada that I think most of our countries have experienced over the course of the last little while, which is the reality that if you're vaccinated, you don't have to quarantine, or that quarantine is reduced. And in our case, in Canada, if you're vaccinated, you don't have to quarantine, but you need to show that you're COVID-free by bringing a test in 72 hours. The test needs to occur 72 hours before you enter. And then when you enter, you get a test immediately. And then you get to come in. But of course, if the test that you get when you enter Canada is negative, you're fine. If it's positive, you get contacted by immigration, and basically you're put in quarantine, and any of your contacts are traced. So yeah, and I think that's a really important change. I think quarantine rules are here to stay. Only 6% of the world is vaccinated. So we're talking, within our countries, we're talking about la crème de la crème in terms of who can come into our respective countries, except for Mexico, of course. But right now in Canada, 80% of our population has at least had one vaccine. And about close to 25% are fully vaccinated. And in the next month, we're getting a ton of vaccines. People are lining up. We're all desperate to get our second vaccine. I have to wait until July 4th for my second vaccine because I got AstraZeneca. Unfortunately, I wish I had waited and gotten either Pfizer or Moderna, because now I'm getting a hybrid vaccine. So I'm getting AstraZeneca, and then on top of it, I'm going to get either Moderna or Pfizer, whatever's available, probably Moderna, because we're getting a huge shipment. So yeah, quarantine rules are not going anywhere. That they're not going to be relaxed. And I think that we're going to see these quarantine rules for at least the next 5 years. And depending on whether we get other pandemics, we've got a prototype. And so I think that we'll have ongoing legislation on this issue if there's more pandemonium in the world. So in terms of other changes that will be reversed, and vaccination is one of the changes that were reversed, because until a couple of weeks ago, we did not recognize vaccination at all. So that's been a change that's been reversed. Regular port of entry processing will resume for visa exempt nationals, I predict, and the family will be processed together at the border with the foreign national. Right now, if you're from France and you want to come to Canada, we have to do visa processing. It's horrible because it takes, depending on what the availability of biometrics, it takes a month or 2 months. Now that people are being vaccinated, it's a little bit faster, and biometric offices are opening in the West. But still, visa processing is such a hassle, when in the past we could just have the French foreign national and his family apply at the port of entry. Now what we're having to do is do visa processing for the French foreign national, and then once he's approved or she's approved, then the spouse and the children can be approved. We apply for them separately. So it's a bit of a problem. It's a real issue right now, and I anticipate that regular processing will resume again. So that's certainly one change that will be reversed, because it's a nightmare for us right now. It's a ton of work, and Europeans are used to applying at the port of entry, so they hate it. And because of the additional work that we're having to do, we have to cover our time, our fees are higher, and obviously the companies don't like that. They you know, I think it's been an issue for all of us where our fees have had to increase. And for companies, it's hard to swallow because of their budgets. When you're dealing with a big company that creates a budget for a certain amount based on past precedent, and this year, all of a sudden, we're doubling or tripling their budget, that is a problem. But fortunately, companies are understanding that immigration has been a challenge and it's taking longer. I'm sure you're finding the same thing. The other requirement based on Canadian legislation is that all entries be non-optional, non-discretionary. What that means is that in order for you to come to Canada, your entry needs to be essential. And there's a whole list of definitions of what's essential. I anticipate that requirement will be reversed, and that optional and discretionary entries will be allowed again, particularly for visa exempt individuals. I think we're going to start with the US first, once the US is a little more vaccinated, and that the optional and discretionary will be tied to vaccinations. And I think that once it works in the US, because the US is our only border country. I know that's shocking for Europeans, but yes, we only have one border and it's with the US. So the US, all policies that we bring out that are more facilitative, they start with the US and then they progress to visa exempt countries. Yeah, so the other change that will be reversed is that immigrants will be allowed to come into Canada again. We were not allowing our immigration folks to come in. Canada is an immigrant country. We have immigrants that have been approved all over the world for immigration, permanent residence to Canada. They were not allowed to come in for the past year, since March of 2020. And now they're all allowed to come in. So they're coming in now. This policy was reversed as of June 21st, and I'm delighted about it. That reversal is fantastic. They're going to have to quarantine, obviously, if they're not vaccinated, but it's great for Canada because we need immigrants. It's very important. So let's turn our attention from changes that will be reversed and that will revert to normal to the bad, ugly situations that won't change at all or won't change yet. So right now we're cutting off countries that are heavily affected by the pandemic. Indians aren't allowed to come to Canada right now. We've blocked all flights. There's absolutely no entries from India. Pakistan had the same issue. We've already reversed that. So with Pakistan, we're allowing people to come into Canada. But we may see the same thing happen in Brazil. So the other thing is, although there is still visa processing in countries like India and Brazil, It's so difficult to obtain biometrics, and our visa offices have skeleton staff. So that makes it very difficult. So we're seeing a real change in terms of the timing and the ability to process visas from high pandemic regions, where applicants can't do biometrics, and the visa staff has been considerably reduced. And unfortunately, that's not going to change, not until these countries get properly vaccinated. Nothing's going to open up, and our visa staff won't go back to normal levels. So it's really affecting business to Canada from those countries and vice versa. And as I discussed earlier, quarantine legislation and requirements are here to stay. They're going to become more complicated as the process goes on, and as new vaccines may be approved over time, and hybrids and sort of half and half vaccinations occur. I'm expecting that the quarantine legislation will not change, but will be expanded substantially. For those who are vaccinated, for those who aren't vaccinated, who can come in, who's not vaccinated, all of that, I see that as being a very fluid situation that's not going to go away, and it's going to create a lot of work for lawyers. We're going to have to keep up with all those changes. The other bad, ugly situation that won't change is family processing for work permit applications for high infected regions of the world. Families are just not being allowed to come into Canada. If the foreign worker needs to come in, fine, but the family, they're going to hold back on the family. They're going to wait till the situation regularizes, or the work permit processing for the spouse and the study permits for the kids are going to get delayed. So I'm not seeing that changing yet, and it's a real issue. We are starting to get foreign workers in again from highly infected regions, but again, it's always a challenge with visa processing and biometrics. But their families, it's still very difficult, and I think that's going to continue to get them to Canada. So let's try to be a little more positive here and discuss good policies that will stay, that were wrought on by the pandemic, and they're going to stay. Well, in Canada, one of the wonderful policies that we're seeing is more processing in Canada rather than visa offices. And that's a really great change. And the reason for that is because visa offices have skeleton staff. They can't just do all the work. So we're hiring Canadians in Canada to do that work. There's an added benefit, and that is that, for example, some countries that help us with visa processing, like the VSF offices, and China's a perfect example, aren't doing a very good job. So visa processing is handled by the Canadian Embassy in China, and partially in Canada. But there's these facilitative visa assistance offices that work in tandem with the Canadian Embassy, and basically it's a contract that the Canadian government has with the Chinese company that does the visa processing and helps immigrants. Now those offices in China, it's been discovered that they're owned by the Chinese police. Imagine you're an individual applying for a work permit or a study permit, or worse, immigration to Canada. The Chinese police could obviously have access to this information. So that needs to change, and the government hasn't changed it yet. They haven't been able to, because it's just so hard to find a way around that ownership link in China. So it's really good that more processing is being done in Canada to avoid that. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is family violence. And I think we've all heard terrible, nightmare stories about children being abused by parents frustrated by the pandemic, spouses being abused by their spouses frustrated by the pandemic. and just everybody at home. It creates a dangerous situation for situations that already are rife with domestic violence. So what the government has done is it's prioritized the processing of victims of family violence. And so they are issuing temporary resident visas and work permits to these to these victims on an extremely fast basis through local office processing. So you can get one very quickly. Sometimes you can get one, a work permit within 10 days for a victim of domestic abuse. And the beauty of this project is that it allows the victim to work in Canada. They get a 6-month work permit. It allows them to access to health insurance so that they can, if they're injured or they need medical assistance, they get our universal medical assistance. And there is consideration to extend their work permits for beyond that. And often what we're able to do long term with these types of situations is do a humanitarian and compassionate application for the victim and the children if necessary. So it's a really lovely change that's been brought on by the pandemic. At least we're able to help people in a very concrete, in a very facilitative, in a quick way. Yeah, so the other really positive change that's here to stay is in the past, whenever you needed to change status, you had to do it through a visa office unless you fell into a group of exceptions that allowed for your ability to change your status from within Canada as an applicant. One of the good policies of the pandemic that we really took advantage of was being able to do that inland. The government instituted a policy that people could do that inland because it was recognized they couldn't go back to their home country to make the change and then come back to Canada. And it was just dangerous for Canadians for them to do that. So how am I doing for time? I'm almost finished. And so what the government did was institute a policy that allowed for inland changes. And I think that the government will continue that policy. It's working so well, and it just makes so much sense. Yeah, and the other good policy is allowing more remote work for foreign workers in or out of Canada, working for Canadian employers. The employer compliance rules have softened, which is really wonderful. And the individuals with remote work opportunities are allowed to apply for permanent residence under the Canada Experience class as long as they're on Canadian payroll and they spend at least 50% of their time in Canada. So, and lastly, a really good policy that will stay is that the government is encouraging vaccination by basically facilitating the entry for those who are vaccinated. And in terms of remote work, I will just say a few things, and that is that basically remote work is turning immigration on its head. Immigration law is predicated on physical presence. That's gone out the window through all of this. And so we're seeing an increase rather than a reduction in temporary immigration, and we're seeing an expansion of work permit exempt entries. Obviously, border control has increased and continues to increase, and the amount of work that lawyers are having to do as a result of border control increase in terms of justifying work permit exempt entries is really truly phenomenal, and I think that's going to continue. And like I say, we're seeing an increase in temporary immigration, and I'm going to stop there because I could go on, but my next point was going to take too long. and we've got 2 more speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. Here, I think your comment
Thank you very much.
About third-party service providers was really fascinating here. That was the first thing I had heard about that, about the change in the paradigm, because their business model is set up on those contracts with governments here, and with the change in the pandemic, it's maybe exposing some issues as well. I think those issues were there before the pandemic, but the pandemic probably put some sunlight on that. So that was really a great point here, and an original point too. So it's really appreciated.
Yes, thank you so much. Sorry, we have to keep the time.
Yeah, I know. We're all over
so we're for the last 2 speakers. So I'd like to move to Ben Shudrick from the UK. Ben, whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much for having me. It's a big question, isn't it? A big topic, and there's a lot to unpick. And I'm going to try to unpick some of it as regards the UK over the course of the next 10 minutes. I think the position in the UK is maybe unique because obviously the pandemic is huge and it's a major piece of the immigration jigsaw when we're looking at the evolution of immigration law, but it's in a way not the biggest event because we've had a lot of other seismic events here over the course of the last 5 years. In particular, obviously Brexit, which you've heard a great deal about in the past, and I'm not going to go through all of that again, other than to say that we've had a political and constitutional rewiring since the 2016 referendum. Curiously, it's the 5th anniversary yesterday of the result of that referendum. It's been an incredibly turbulent and politically charged period. And of course, that has had a major impact on immigration law and practice here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the development of immigration law and in particular what it means for our relationship with Europe, but also, of course, trends emerging from the pandemic, as my colleague speakers have done, notably, of course, around border control and also remote working and flexible working. So in the UK, there's a confluence of factors at play. There's the pandemic constraints, which in terms of border control and other liberties really represent the most serious interference in the rights and privileges of individuals to cross borders in our lifetimes, justified, of course, on the basis, on the principle of proportionality in relation to a major global health crisis, operating on the basis of public consent, which is beginning perhaps to erode to some extent here. We're entering into the school holiday period in a couple of weeks, and there you can sense the tension amongst families who may not be able to enjoy some form of holiday this year, particularly in Europe, as has been the practice of the Brits for many, many decades. But also these kind of constraints run contrary to the instincts of our leaders. We obviously have a conservative government here, but it's one which is broadly libertarian in instinct. Boris Johnson is a libertarian, and the pandemic measures that he has been forced to impose run, I think, counter to his natural instincts, and contrary to his natural policy. It's a little bit like the approach taken to public spending. Again, we have a conservative government, but the public expenditure over the course of the last year has not been remotely conservative in a fiscal sense. So I think the government's instincts will be for many of these measures to be short term, but at the same time to balance the needs of the British people and of course the world at large in terms of protecting us against this pandemic or indeed future pandemics or variants of the current one. We have gone over the course of the last few years through a major restructure in terms of immigration. We're only beginning to see the impact now in 2021, as I say, 5 years after the referendum. Why is that the case? Because we've been arguing for the last 5 years. The government spent 4 years arguing with itself about what Brexit meant, and then, of course, negotiating and to some extent arguing with our neighbours in the European Union. We finally settled on a withdrawal agreement back in 2019 after Boris Johnson won a general election, and then, of course, entered a transition period to the end of 2020, by which time, of course, we were in the middle of this crisis. And we only left the single market which obviously includes the freedom of movement of people at the end of 2020. But that position carried on to some extent under transitional arrangements, but also more importantly, we were unable to travel because of the pandemic. So we haven't really seen the full impact of the Brexit position. So looking at our UK immigration laws in the context of the overarching policy, one of which was, of course, to regain national sovereignty and take control of our borders. And we had to leave the single market in order to achieve that because of the indivisibility of the four freedoms contained in the single market, which of course are freedom of goods, services, capital, and people. And so decisions on entry are now taken by immigration officers and consular officers abroad in our visa centres under domestic law. There's no longer a right of entry to the UK for EU citizens under the freedom of movement provisions. And we have had to create a whole new framework for UK immigration control, which is at the core of the question posed this afternoon. The principles and the objectives of the new policy are stated as being to create a high wage, high skill, high productivity economy, and also to create a level playing field, no longer administering two streams of immigration, the EU free movement stream and the rest of the world schemes, a shift away from reliance on cheap labor from Europe and a focus more on high-tech immigration. And the mechanism for controlling entry to the UK is a points-based system. In fact, we've had a points-based system for a long time, but it's been reconfigured in line with the launch of the new immigration schemes, which, as I say, came into place at the beginning of this year when we finally left the single market. One thing that is, I think, very interesting about this, and perhaps counterintuitive given the context, is that under the current government, immigration policy has in fact become, I think, more liberal and less constrained than under the Theresa May government, and also Theresa May's period of time as Home Secretary before she became Prime Minister. We no longer have any caps on immigration. We don't have quotas. We don't have any net migration targets, which was the position here for many years, the desire to reduce net migration to the tens of thousands annually, a target that was in fact never met. The focus now is on immigration at sustainable levels. So there's no quantum on that. And at the core of the new scheme is the skilled worker route, which is based pretty much on the previous Tier 2 scheme that you may be familiar with. But the basic logic behind it is that what is sustainable in terms of immigration can be determined by the needs of the economy and the labor market. So it's really down to employers to decide who they need. And that really is the difference between the old scheme and the new scheme. One, there's no cap on numbers. And secondly, there is no more resident labor market testing here in the UK for employer sponsorship. And that's quite revolutionary because we've had a resident labor market testing regime for, well, certainly as long as I can remember. And I've been doing this for quite a long time. So the main criteria for entry to work are that you're coming for a skilled role as defined in government codes of practice. You have a job offer from a licensed sponsor. And there really is the rub for employers because there are duties and obligations associated with being a licensed sponsor, as well as costs, of course. The role has to meet a salary threshold, which is set at just over £25,000, which is relatively low as a threshold. And there's an English language requirement for long-term sponsorship, not for intra-company transfers, but certainly for long-term sponsorship. That can create difficulties actually under the new scheme, because of course there are 27 or more languages spoken across the European Union. Most countries, apart from Ireland, don't have English as their first language. So for the first time in 40 plus years, EU citizens are required to prove their ability to speak English before they can come here and engage in sponsored work. But the price of all of this, and it is a fairly relatively easy scheme to administer, but the price is twofold for employers. One is the cost, transactional costs to the government, but also more than that, there are charges and levies by way of heavy taxation applied to immigration applications, such as the National Health Service surcharge. So it's very expensive. So you have to want to do it in order to cover that cost. And two, compliance. There's a lot of record keeping, monitoring, risk of audits, legal right to work checks, etc., associated with being a licensed sponsor, which, as I say, is the sort of the core root at the center of our current immigration framework. And immigration, through that compliance regime, immigration control is devolved to employers. So I guess the overarching test for employers in our new framework is really, is it worth the hassle of engaging with the scheme? What we're seeing at the moment is, and certainly this is over the last couple of months, last year during the pandemic, as in line with the rest of the world, immigration was down in terms of sponsorship, etc. But we are now beginning to see quite a significant increase in applications, very significant year on year, which suggests that there is much more engagement now with the immigration framework, in a sense perhaps that we've turned a corner on the pandemic. That may be something to do with the success of our own vaccine program, which unlike some of the shambles that we encountered last year, has been very successful here in the UK. But we're certainly seeing increased volumes of activity now. So the core sponsorship scheme appears to be working. There is a lot of work to be done here on supply side immigration routes and schemes for entrepreneurs. We don't have a highly skilled migrant program, and I think that the economy could benefit from that. We do have some useful schemes, such as the Global Talent Program for highly achieving individuals who obtain an endorsement to come here. We have a graduate scheme which has just been introduced this summer, actually, for students who obtain degrees here in the UK, and they can stay here and work for 2 years and then potentially switch their status into the skilled worker route over the long term, and that would be a route to settlement. We have youth mobility schemes, particularly with 8 countries from the Commonwealth, which applies to people aged 18 to 30 who can come here to work for 2 years. We're also beginning to see the emergence of some mobility chapters within free trade agreements. We signed an in-principle agreement with Australia recently that contains more generous provisions for young Australian citizens to come here for 3 years rather than 2 if they're under 35. So the age bracket has increased. But we do lack here a decent entrepreneur scheme. We have an innovator program, we have a startup program, but there isn't a huge amount of take-up of those schemes because they're quite difficult to engage with, and they require endorsement from endorsing bodies who seem reluctant to get involved. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there in terms of entrepreneurs and innovators. What we are seeing here particularly, and I know a couple of you have spoken about this already this afternoon, is a real increase on digitization, a move away from paperwork, focus on simplification, and the government is committed to a digital end-to-end journey for immigration in the future. In that context, we will see implementation of an ETA, an Electronic Travel Authority, which is a version of the the US's ESTA program, similar kind of pre-travel authorization. That should come in, I think, next year. At the same time, the European Union will introduce their version of the same thing, which is called an ETIAS, a European Travel Information and Authorization System. So we're seeing moves towards digitization and prior approval to travel rather than control at entry, which should facilitate entry. On the sort of the broader trends in global immigration, obviously the big topic at the moment is remote working and our famous digital nomads. The question is it a real thing? I think the answer to that is yes. It's obviously a trend that has been accelerated by the pandemic and the health crisis. Also in the context of flexible working policies, and the fact that technology makes it possible for people to work in all sorts of different places, whereas 10 years ago, it really wouldn't have been possible in the way that it is now. And also in the context of competition for talent, people are looking for more flexible working opportunities, different ways of working, and I think employers inevitably will have to respond to that. Few governments have really responded to it in a clever way. Some have, and the background to that is coming up with innovative schemes that encourage engagement with that country, encourage inward investment, and of course, consumer expenditure. Remote workers spend money, and that's good for the local economy. Countries that have come up with innovative programs include the UAE, Estonia, I think some of the Caribbean countries that see this as an opportunity to gain investment and expenditure. I know that there are programs in Barbados, Bermuda, Mexico, I think, has a program. So we will see the emergence of more of that, I think, in the future. The UK is a little bit behind the curve on this. And it really goes, often these questions go to the root of what we do as immigration lawyers, because you're in the position of advising between what a person could do as a visitor, what is legitimate activity as a business visitor, and what constraints are contained around that in terms of what you can do and how long you can be in the country. And then, of course, the other side of the coin being, well, if you don't qualify there, you're going to need a work permit. But for that, you need a local sponsor, most likely. You need a job that meets particular criteria in the country, or may even include resident labour market testing. So I think that is definitely emerging, but it's at the early stage of emergence in terms of global immigration laws. So I think I'm going to stop there because I'm conscious of time, and you've only got 10 minutes left.
Yes, thank you so much, Ben.
Yeah, about 15 per day, it's good here, but thanks, Ben, if we have any time.
Yes, thank you so much. It was a very interesting presentation indeed. So last but not least, and we need to keep the time to 90 minutes, otherwise for the UIA purposes. Dirk, the floor is yours to wrap up this, and I'm sure in a beautiful way.
I will do my best. So as I said, I will speak in abbreviations to make it short. So no, I wanted to highlight two things. So first of all, the regulation that the EU published last week, approved 2 weeks ago, and published last week in the official journal on the EU COVID-19 certificates that will be applicable in the entire Schengen area as from the 1st of July, so in 5 days from now. So it's probably the quickest approved regulation in the history of the European Union, because the draft was proposed by the Commission in March of this year, and 2 weeks ago it was already approved. So that's very quick for a regulation, because an EU regulation is applicable immediately in the entire, well, as from the 1st of July in this case, as from the in the entire European Union, plus also for this one, also the Schengen area, although there's still negotiations going on with Switzerland, amongst other things. So what the EU's digital certificate is going to be in the first place, so as from the 1st of July, it will be for traveling within the European Union and the Schengen area. So if people want to go from Belgium to Spain, for instance, they can travel with this digital certificate without any issues. Now, the condition under which you get the EU digital certificate. So first of all, there were already some countries that had a digital certificate on a local platform. So they are now all adding their system to the EU platform. Yesterday, I checked 17 countries out of the 27 have already done it, plus Iceland. And you get the digital certificate when you have been vaccinated, so fully vaccinated. So for Johnson & Johnson, it's one vaccination, and for the other one, other ones it's 2, but it needs to be, you get it automatically if your vaccination is a vaccination approved by the European Medical Agency. So as Andreea said, for instance, earlier today, she spoke about the Sputnik one, that you do not get automatically. If you have been vaccinated with Sputnik, you do not automatically get the certificate, because that's the countries can decide locally whether they approve also Sputnik or not. That's locally countries can decide. Doesn't mean that if you have been vaccinated with Sputnik and France does not recognize it, that you cannot go to France, because you can still do a PCR test, because that's a second possibility. If you have had a negative PCR test, then or if you have been vaccinated, it can also and no nothing else, that you can also enter Europe and go in quarantine. But I know a lot of people do not like that. So, but the digital certificate, you get vaccinated or negative PCR test, or if you have built up enough antibodies. So if you have had COVID-19, so then you get the certificate and you can travel freely within the Schengen area. There are also negotiations going on at the moment with the UK and the US, so to recognize each other's systems. So that's also going on. So that is something for intra-EU travel that is going to be valid as from the 1st of July. This system is going to be valid for 1 year. And then it will depend on the situation. In principle, as soon as the WHO says that the pandemic is over, the system will stop. But if the pandemic is not over, it will still be applicable for at least 1 year. And then at the end of, end of June next year, the EU will decide, do we have to continue this or shall we stop it? So, and also revisit whether it's really working or not. So that's one thing I wanted to highlight in my few minutes. Another thing, I agree fully with Jacqueline when she said the situation now, this pandemic creates a lot of work, or will create a lot of work for lawyers. I fully agree with that, not only immigration lawyers, because what I've also seen over the last year, especially here in Europe, is that immigration lawyers, labor lawyers, tax lawyers, social security lawyers worked much closer together than ever before, because there's a lot of issues also, like, for instance, remote work, nomad visas, have tax implications, as Ben also said. Okay, you get a nomad visa in Estonia, but then you will have to pay tax in Estonia. So there are specific rules that apply regarding social security tax. Then you have, I think it was Patricia who said, and many countries have that now in Europe, for instance, the commuters, the no impact policy that exists at the moment for people who are under, for instance, the Swiss social security system, but now work or are staying at home in France because their employer does not allow them to come to the office. So, well, at the moment there's no impact policy. We'll have no social security implications until the end of the year, but that probably will change as from next year. So all these lawyers will have to work together to find solutions. Another thing I wanted to highlight also is that what we have seen is that, and there has been already a lot of information about that in the press, that there's a disconnect at the moment between, on the one hand, how the executive thinks, and on the other hand, how the employees think at the moment regarding the hybrid working system, working from home. There have been surveys. We have LinkedIn has done a survey, I've noticed, but also we at EY, we have recently done a survey. And what we have seen, for instance, is that 60% of the employees want in the future to work at least 2 or 3 days from home. And of course, what we will see now with the young talent is that they will choose their employer based on how many days they can work from home. Deloitte, for instance, last week announced that their employees will be allowed to work from home forever if they want, so they can choose. So that is things that we see. On the other hand, what will remain forever, I think, is the war for talent. That will remain. war for talent will continue, because you see in many countries that there are here in the EU, but also in the US, I think, and probably also in the UK, you see a lot of job shortages. So in several sectors. So the EU has proposed 2 weeks ago, on the 11th of June, they have unveiled an EU talent partnership where they will cooperate with third countries on immigration and mobility. They will combine mobility schemes for talented workers with investments in the countries they come from. So the priority countries for this partnership between the EU and these countries, priority countries will be Africa, and also the countries in Europe's neighborhood or in the EU's neighborhood, like the Mediterranean Basin, Eastern Europe, the Western Balkan. And so to help fixing the job shortages that exist in key sectors like healthcare, social care, ICT, logistics, agriculture, and construction. So the war for talent will continue. Immigration lawyers still have a future. But yeah, there will be some changes. One other thing I also quickly wanted to mention before it's time is because of the globalization, we are much more exposed to things or to ideas coming, for instance, from the United States common law system, different from European continental law system. And what we've seen, like I think it was Citibank last week that announced that in the US, it can be another bank too. So if somebody's from Citibank, I apologize if it's not true. But I think it was Citibank that said that that employees are only allowed to come to the office if they are vaccinated. And they have to show, at the moment not yet, but soon they will also have to show the proof that they are vaccinated. That is, in the countries that I know in Europe, where I know the law from, Belgium, the Netherlands, illegal. That's absolutely illegal. An employer cannot ask an employee whether he's vaccinated or not, because that's even in Holland, for instance, that's in the constitution. That's your physical integrity, and the employer, that's none of his business. So there you see, there will be court cases soon, I'm sure. There are going to be court cases. Labor lawyers will have work with that. Also, other thing I wanted to mention, I think was also Andreea who said, with the remote workers, which law is going to be applicable will also be very important, because, for instance, there are some mandatory rules in employment law, which even if you decide that your employment contract is going to be the labor law of Papua New Guinea, and you work then in France, there are mandatory rules of French labor law that are applicable. Switzerland the same, Belgium the same, like for instance, working times. In France, you have 35 hours, I think. Switzerland has 42, Belgium has 38. So those are differences. Well, I don't know how much Papua New Guinea has, but where you then have to stay with the law of the mandatory law of the country where you are. So those are all, it's going to be very complicated for people to understand. So there, the lawyers still have a future. Was that quick enough, or do you want me to speak more?
Perfect.
That was perfect. That was perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We're right on time. It's 11:30 here in New York.
Yeah. Yes.
I would really like to thank everyone today and also yesterday for putting together this mid-year seminar. I think we had great presentations. The quality is great, and I'm sure the other members of the UIA who were not able to listen to our presentation live will be able to listen to the presentation when they will be posted onto the UIA website, which we will do shortly after we have these available. I hope to see all of you in Madrid in late October. I know that it's going to be a great Congress, given the way it's been organized by the Spanish committee. And if there's anything else, and if we're all happy for the weekend to start, I will we can stop the recording, and I will hopefully see everyone in Madrid in October, if not before. Thank you so much, and have a great weekend, all of you.
Thank you.